It takes me a little while to get going. But welcome, everybody. Can everybody see my screen now? Welcome to Racy Conversations, and this is our webinar on, let's see, yes, white supremacy, class, and COVID. And I'll let Shane, why don't you take it from here?
Great. Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shane Lloyd, and I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Karen, for creating this space. You can connect with me, Famous Seamus, on Instagram or Twitter. I'm mostly involved in Instagram, and then occasionally offer a few thoughts when the neurons are firing very closely on Twitter. So we're delighted to be in this conversation because these are really important topics and very important lenses to apply as we think about COVID. So these are also huge topics, so we're being very ambitious, everybody. So feel free to add to the topics that we are putting at the center with any and all questions, things that are keeping you up, or as one of my favorite co-facilitators likes to say, if you're mad about it, let's chat about it. This is definitely the place.
Yes, and trust me, Shane and I are very, very chatty. When we get together, it's like a nerd out festival on racism and classism and all of these topics, which is why I'm so grateful that you made time to join us. I'm Karen Fleshman. I'm the founder of Racy Conversations. And a little while ago, I was on Twitter and I was like, who is this very intelligent person tweeting? And then I realized, oh, he's my friend. So I said, we got to get together and do a show. And that's what led to this. So thank you for joining us. And please do let us know where you're joining from. And we're going to start with a moment of silence. So Shane, you want to lead us through this?
Sure. Our community has been through so much. Our human community, but particularly the Black community. We've had the viral video of Ahmaud Arbery's murder on sort of circulating across social media. And I just wanted to, his murder is also situated within this conversation around white supremacy. The violence that sort of spurs that ideology and that system is real and ever present today. When we think about history and the sort of image of a man was lynched yesterday and how that could happen in 2020 in that grotesque way, we really have to hold that in mind and in our hearts. So I just wanted to spend 25 seconds just holding his family, holding his memory, and holding all of those who have been lost to this violence in our minds and hearts, especially as we set some of the groundwork for this conversation. So if you're comfortable for you, close your eyes, or you can keep your eyes open. Either is okay. I will set the timer. Thank you. I also want to make sure to acknowledge that May 5th, at the start of this week, was the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And that's another sort of trauma that a community is enduring, the Indigenous community and then the broader human community. And being able to consider that the violence that is born out of white supremacy is impacting a lot of communities simultaneously. And that is not only just cataclysmic, but it's also a lot to hold in our minds and hearts. So when we think about community trauma, how can we also keep in conversation to our capacity and ability the traumas that other communities are experiencing? Because particularly in this moment, it's integral that we engage in sort of inter-ethnic solidarity and coalition building, and holding in mind some of the histories and present day sort of realities of communities that are can also help us secure our liberation, but we also need to support them in their sort of liberation and sovereignty.
Yes, and I want to share with everyone that at next week, right at this same time, I'm going to be engaged in conversation with Sweetwater Nanauk, who is a Native Alaskan woman and an activist in First Nation communities. So she's the founder of Idle No More Washington. And we're going to be talking about reclaiming our health care. And I'll share the details for that upcoming webinar at the end of this. So I really am so glad, Shane, that we chose to start our conversation today thinking about uh, those who are missing, murdered, and continue to be um, terrorized by white supremacy, and that everybody in this call, we are united, we are horrified, and we are working toward ending white supremacy and ending this type of violence.
Okay. Now, with all that we've discussed, I just wanted to, this is a placeholder slide. What I'd really like to invite us to do is to reflect on, and feel free to share in the chat, what are some things that you're grateful for? What are some opportunities for gratitude? I know for sure I'm definitely expressing gratitude to Karen for creating this space and opportunity for us to form a community and have a conversation about these powerful issues. I'm also really grateful for the Pulitzer, I don't know what they call it, an institution, academy, whatever, for awarding Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author and sort of architect of the 1619 Project, with that amazing award. I think it's an awesome recognition, and quite amazing that at the same time she's recognized, Ida B. Wells, who is one of her inspirational figures, was also awarded posthumously. So I'm grateful for opportunities for recognition and celebration. So I see in the chat, Colton Whitehead. Anyone else in the chat? What are you grateful for? What is some gratitude? It's a great best practice in virtual settings is waiting 10 to 15 seconds so that way people have time to unmute themselves or type. Oh, Colson.
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy to everyone joining us. Ashley in Myrtle Beach says she's happy to be here and see you both. Folks are happy to join in this conversation with us. I'm grateful to you, Shane. I'm grateful that I know you. I'm grateful for everything I learned from you. And I'm really excited to be able to share that with my community. I'm also just grateful to have a platform. As you all know, I've been now removed from LinkedIn twice. I don't think it's because I'm violating their content. I think it's because someone's trying to hack me and take over my account. But I just want everyone. We need to have each other's contact information and be in touch with each other. And so I'm glad that you all decided to join us here today. Grateful for solidarity to dismantle racism and white supremacy. I'm grateful for a space like this and for what you are both doing in this movement. Thank you so much, y'all. This is so great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we're and then grateful that there are individuals who are willing to discuss this topic in an open forum and not simply in private settings. Without a doubt. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cool.
+1 to the fist.
Now, I'm confused. What do you all see? Do you see my screen or do you see the presentation?
I see part of the presentation and I see your screen and then it's part of the presentation. So we might just have to just do the present screen so it's a little bit bigger.
Okay, let's see. What do we do here?
Oh, that's just the minimize.
Oh dear. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, here we go. Okay, good.
And business, yes. Okay, now we're going to dive in. So I think that particularly with conversations around white supremacy, we first have to define the term so we can have a shared understanding. That's part of it's me, the nerd, then part of it's also just academic socialization, where if we're not clear on terms and definitions, then we get into a windy web. Additionally, I find that with terms and definitions, it allows people to really not wiggle their way out of this is too controversial, or what are you saying, or you must hate all white people, or poo. No. Let's talk about this term. So white supremacy is defined as a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. Now, I think this definition offers us a really useful grounding point around when we think about the ideology and the idea of white supremacy. that ideology can be animated by anybody. Every single body can contribute to this virulent system. So in some ways, this definition sort of sets some context and puts us all on alert around how we all need to be very, very vigilant around this system that we're all sort of steeped in and socialized by. And then who ultimately benefits and at what cost. And when we,
Shane,
yeah.
oh, sorry. Can you also share where you got this definition? Who
Oh,
can?
yes. Hold on, I will. This is actually from, I have like multiple screens, everyone, so pardon me. This is actually from Racial Equity Tools, has this great definition, but I also want to make sure that you have the accurate source. And I just clicked it too. Well, that's what happens when you have entirely too many screens open.
And as Shane is looking for the source, is this definition resonating with you? Is this your understanding of white supremacy? And please feel free to put that in the chat.
Let's see. Here we go, glossary. Yeah, the racial equity tools, I like it because they have a nice repository of terms, so it just makes it easy to recall. So this definition comes from Dismantling Racism Works. So I can also include this in our follow-up email to everybody with terms and resources. So I see yeses, 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 very much so. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And part of why, and thank you so much for that question, Karen, because I think what's also important is for us to really just be generous in sharing our resources. Some of this information is readily available in different places. And as we think about how we bring these conversations to different places outside of our private, trusted inner circle, it also becomes important for us to say, where are we looking? What resonates? Also, there is not a lot of consensus around the definition of white supremacy. There was a whole Atlantic article that discussed the trials and tribulations. I was originally actually going to borrow a definition from The Racial Contract by Caribbean philosopher Charles Mills, but the language was too high philosophy. So I figured plain language, ideally. But nonetheless, it sort of allows us to really think about, this is what we're up against, and this is how it manifests. So next slide. So what I wanted to do was help us see how is it that white supremacy is propagated, even as we might hear lots of denials around, what are you talking about white supremacy? That's only the KKK. What are you talking about whiteness as a construct? We're all individuals. Well, not only can anybody animate white supremacy, we also just have to be vigilant around, if we're all absorbing this information, sometimes explicitly and passively, it becomes critical for us to be very, very vigilant on where it comes up. So here, diversity in the publishing industry. This was a survey conducted across the major publishing houses by Lee and Low Books, because they were trying to figure out, how do we actually get our arms around the diversity and inclusion challenges and pitfalls within the publishing industry. And you can see here that they have the industry overall, and 75% of people leading or animating the staff of publishing companies are white. That's huge, because these are the folks who are telling the stories and publishing the works that either end up on the New York Times bestseller list or help us understand and make meaning of the world that we live in. If a disproportionate number of those perspectives are uncritical or unconscious or not thoughtfully representing the true and complex multiracial reality of the United States, that is a breeding ground for white supremacist ideology. Now, they may not use that language, but we can see the impact of that. Next up.
I think this was really made clear with the controversy around American Dirt, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you know, I wrote about it because I said, it's not as if white people can't tell other people's stories, but if we are going to tell other people's stories, we have to do it in a way that is accountable and rooted in their truth. You know, and what I was reflecting on too was how Sofia Coppola, when she made that movie, and she omitted the Black character from the movie. And she said, you know, I didn't feel like I could tell I could tell her story. So I just got rid of the character. And it's like, no, that is irresponsible. Like
Right.
if we as cultural creators have to expand our understanding, and you know, if we don't have the expertise, then we should seek out someone who does and pay them to help us create something that's going to be true and authentic. And definitely, I think we have a responsibility to recruit uh, higher numbers of people of color, of people of you know, trans, and we need
Mm-hmm.
more. We need all different kinds of sexualities. Everybody needs to be represented in cultural creation. Um, and those of us who are in these spaces and who have power, that means we're going to have to step down. We're going to have to step down and make space and create space for more people to rise up.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. So let me just send a quick text. So Karen just switched off the video. What I'm gonna do is, are you back, Karen?
Oh yes, I don't know what happened. Did my maybe
Yeah, your
my
camera froze.
oh no. Okay, okay. Maybe my Wi-Fi freaked out for a minute.
Potentially. Here's what I can do. Let me see if I will share my screen as a
Oh,
backup
okay,
option.
there you go.
Desktop 1. Let's hope this works. Oh, open systems and preferences to grant access.
So you're gonna share your screen?
Yes.
So Shane, before we dive into the next.
Oh. I don't think I have I don't have it set up in my computer just yet. Do you mind sharing the screen? Let's see.
I thought
Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties.
yes. I'm sorry, I'm
Hold on.
doing a webinar right now. I'll call you later. Yeah, sorry folks, we're having a couple glitches here. Let me see if I should get closer to my router that would allow us to have a stronger internet connection. Okay, let's keep the conversation going. Shane, how are you able to?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I see your screen.
Oh, perfect. Great. Present. Okay, we're in business. Thanks everyone for your patience and for hanging with us in the midst of these technical difficulties. So next up is thinking about when we talk about who's representing us in Congress, who is duking it out, who is setting these policies, who is challenging the president or not, when it comes to how we're even responding to COVID. And you can see here that compared to the US population, Congress is a great deal wider than the population of the United States. So that means decision makers, policy makers, people who are interpreting advancements around how laws advance or block opportunities for people to accumulate assets or have their rights protected and served. That is also a distortion. So we have to really consider that very meaningfully when it comes to our elected officials. Additionally, how do we continue to have these conversations in places where there may not be a critical mass of people of color, for example? I think of this one book that I really enjoy called What If All the Kids Are White? How can people still have conversations around race, even if the community is 100% white? Because whiteness is still a tool that could become critically conscious. And we also have to just broadly think about, like, in the United States, in a white supremacist culture, where are the opportunities for someone to develop a healthy sense of their white identity, especially if they're going to wield power on others?
Yes. And this to me really evokes Shirley Chisholm's book, Unbought and Unbossed, which I think everyone must read. And she talks about this, how the Congress is so ineffective because it is largely a club of white men who are, and they're rewarded for having very little ambition and for maintaining the status quo. They have the mindset of a small town lawyer or a small town grain uh, elevator operator. And that as long as they kind of toe the line, they can get reelected over and over again. And this was really made clear to me. You know, I was part of the group protesting the Kavanaugh confirmation, and just seeing the senators on that judiciary committee, and many of them are over 80 years old, and they've been there for 40 years or more. And the way that the way that they behave, like they are just completely feel absolutely no degree of accountability whatsoever to the public. It's like their little club in there. And what gives me hope is like what happened in the midterm 2018, where we did elect so many really amazing millennial women and women of color in particular. And I'm just so excited to see this renewed energy in the Congress, and I want to see more of it. And I want to see us take back that US Senate. Very, very important.
Let's see.
What is this evoking for folks as you're watching this? Does this make sense to you? What we're talking about in terms of white supremacy in the Congress and in the publishing industry? Oh, and one more point before we talk about that. One of the things you were tweeting that I really loved, Shane, was around ahistorical DEI and how it's Pollyannish. And I think this is very much relates to this slide, right? So if we're teaching unconscious bias, but we're not teaching, well, why do we have these stereotypes? Who created these stereotypes and why? Then what are we really doing?
Precisely. Because here's the part about it. The unconscious bias is a neurological process, and it's not ahistorical, because we're doing a lot of passive learning, not just in what active and explicit messaging we're receiving, but also absence. Who is holding seats of power? Who do we see teaching us? Which actually is a perfect transition to, not this one, public education. Sort of thinking about elementary and secondary school teachers by race and ethnicity, the vast majority of them being white, and how does that reflect the students that they're teaching? Who do we see as wise? Who do we see as educated? Who do we see as worthy of having authority? And then this also makes me think about how what we know from some of the research is that professors of color, women faculty members are oftentimes evaluated very differently than their white male colleagues, even if all the instructors are communicating the same information and then achieving the consistent set of learning objectives. So who we see over the course of our lives holding authority is not just some innocuous construct. It really does shape how we experience other people and evaluate them. And then thinking about how it comes back to DE&I, oftentimes it can be very appealing. I think of relationship science, where they talk about the harsh startup and the soft startup. Harsh startup is like yelling at somebody. The soft startup is, I'm going to ease in. Do you have time to have this conversation? I had this observation. So I think of sometimes unconscious bias being that soft startup. And it's okay if you opt to start soft, but do not do it in an ahistorical manner, because the internal messaging that people are operating from with regard to unconscious bias, one, has real material impact in the world, and two, is not innocuous given some of what takes place.
Yes,
in history and in the present day.
And the Black women academics who are the most outspoken, I mean, they are, the white supremacists are targeting universities and trying to silence these women. They get death threats. You know, it is very, very intense. They have students, you know, taking their classes and going online and writing all these lies about them. It is really, really terrifying. These women are really vulnerable for being so outspoken, and we need to be there to support them and to shield them from these attacks.
Right. And then there's oftentimes the mischaracter, or rather the distortion of some of the institutions college universities being completely progressive or even radical and the like. And that's also a narrative that's told, but you also have to think of some of the history of these institutions. Many of these institutions wouldn't be progressive and radical, and then also landing in the news for institutional racism if the characterizations that were in the news were completely true and deeply felt by some of the students who are underrepresented, operating at the margins, and pushing these institutions to become more critically conscious and align with their values, quite frankly.
And even how some of these institutions got started rooted in slavery, right? Georgetown, Harvard, Brown, etc. The reason why they have such large endowments and how they got their original funding is from profits of white supremacy.
Yeah, and I have my grad degree, my master's of public health is from Brown, and I attended the institution at the same time as Ruth Simmons was president, and Ruth Simmons was the first Black woman to head an Ivy League institution and was the descendant of slaves and essentially pulled together the resources of the institution to turn an unflinching eye to that history, to think about what is Brown's relationship to slavery, what can we do in the present day with an understanding of that acknowledgement, and then how do we memorialize this history such that that is also a part of the education that people receive around being able to grasp history, because the present is also informed by the past, and distancing ourselves doesn't allow us to actually ameliorate the sins of the past.
Yes, Ashley is saying here, as someone who works in higher education, this resonates and hits hard.
Awesome. I can't see the chat anymore, so I'm gonna have to rely on you to share.
Oh, yeah. I had to create a window to see the chat when
Oh, okay.
yes, it's a little confusing. But keep rolling. We got it because we're almost at half an hour.
I know. Where does time go? Oh, I see. There we go. Chat now over here. Okay, great. One thing, so this also leads us to how we want to talk about classism. So here's a quote from one of my favorite academics, George Lipschitz, who says, "Whiteness has a cash value. It accounts for advantages that come to individuals through profits made from housing secured in discriminatory markets, through unequal educational opportunities available to children of different races, through insider networks that channel employment opportunities to relatives and friends of those who profit most from present and past racial discrimination, and especially through intergenerational transfers of inherited wealth that pass on the spoils of discrimination to succeeding generations." So I put this slide in here as a sort of linkage between white supremacy and this conversation around classism. Oftentimes when we're talking about these issues, we talk about racism, sexism, and then class kind of gets tagged on, but not really dealt with in a very substantive sense, in my opinion. And that's why I really love being a part of Class Action, the organization of which everyone's ticket is donating, because Class Action really aims to create a world without classism and brings together that sort of racism analysis and classism analysis to really think about what is some of the machinery that animates this system and sort of facilitates resource deprivation.
And Charles has a great question for us. How do we
Sure,
function as a collective to push back against these injustices in the educational system, knowing that so many people will not act unless the problem touches them personally?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. That is so important. And I think that in addition to being touched personally, there are two things that have to happen. One, where do people find accurate representations of history, for one? And then two, how do we actually make history very, very personal? So one organization I really am a huge fan of is this organization called United for a Fair Economy. I'll include the link to their resources at the end of the session. And what they have is a lot of content that's actually free for anybody to sort of peruse and present wherever they might be, or host small conversations around, looking at the relationship between wealth inequality and racism. And what I especially like about their work is they figure out, how do you make history personal? So one time I did a training with them, and they actually had this massive wall with a poster talking about boost and blocks from 1776 to the present day. And our task was, as participants, to look at this set of laws in American history and figure out what were the laws that actually allowed for asset accumulation in your family or blockage. So we're talking about Indigenous removal, we're talking about slavery, we're talking about the Homestead Act, the GI Bill, and the like. My family they are immigrants from the Caribbean, St. Kitts and Nevis. So our history in the United States doesn't go that far, but then I had to really think about, well, what were the laws that actually allowed my parents to even enter the country legally? And that kind of exercise really helped make history personal. So I think in response to your awesome question, Charles, is not only do we have to think about how do we have to really think about what are those touch points that help not only make the present day, but also history personal to people, because that can really create a level of concern, or just rather an awakening to begin to activate people. What I also want to say too is we ideally would want to activate everyone, but it also becomes, we really need to think strategically around who are we targeting these campaigns for? And if there are people with a great deal of influence, power, and reach, we have to think, is it that we want to change their minds and hearts, or do we want to leverage our power for accountability?
I also think I'm very influenced by Dr. Ibram Kendi, who says
Mm-hmm.
racism is born out of self-interest, it only dies out of self-interest. And so I'm always trying to tap into how can we tap into the self-interest of white people in dismantling racism and white supremacy. So one of my big points is, especially with millennials, educating them about, I don't think there's ever been a generation of white Americans who have as much to gain from dismantling racism
Mm-hmm.
as white millennials, because they have been so screwed over by systemic racism. So for example, here in California, we used to have the best public university system in the world, really.
Mm-hmm.
Then we instituted mass incarceration, and our budget for public universities went down by the same amount that our budget for incarceration went up. And so now
Mm.
our the quality of our universities has gone down. They've had to admit a lot of foreign students just to pay their bills. So there is a direct impact on white Californian millennials not having access to a great public university system, because we have chosen as a society to invest in incarcerating Black and Brown people. And that's just one example of ways that systemic racism disadvantages, in particular, white millennials.
Mm-hmm. Because there's a great deal of loss both. And then we think about the work of James Baldwin, who talks about the loss of like how white people lose their soul by investing in this system, and how can you know yourself if you're not even one reckoning with the aspects of you that you're heaping onto others around sort of villainizing and demonizing them.
Yes. Along that line, Shane, I'd love to hear from you as we get into the conversation about class. When did you first develop your class consciousness?
Great question. So my class story is an interesting one, specifically because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, Valley Stream, New York, and very middle class for the most part. And I remember I went to a private school when my family was living in Queens. And when I talked to my parents about it, I said, well, why did you decide to put us in public school while we're living in Long Island? And they thought, oh, well, the property taxes are so expensive, it might as well be a private school. And then they had the resources to put us in a private school when we were living in Queens, because they frankly did not have faith in the public school system in the boroughs. Um, so a lot of my experience was very sort of, one, informed by my parents having grown up as immigrants. So I had a very sort of middle class identity, but then my father was very much a race man. He read extensively about sort of liberation movements all across the world. He could talk about politics in the United States and the UK. And my mother, on the other hand, was very, even though she was very culturally Caribbean, she wanted us to be as American as humanly possible. So our sort of messaging growing up was really around assimilation. And then there was my dad. So, so it was a bit of a cultural tension. And part of my class awakening came when I was an undergrad and began to realize, wait a minute, here I am fighting for sort of racial justice, and then getting deeply upset when people were like, oh no, this has nothing to do with race, it's economic issues. And then finally like, yes and no, and then sort of being complicated by that. And then the bulk of my class awakening actually came through class action, because in 2013, we had to do an intensive sort of train the trainer. And it was at that opportunity that I could really begin to sort of develop more sophistication around my class understanding and think about what is this relationship to someone who is both Black, but then also has a middle class experience, which is a different kind of reality, but also has parents who grew up in the Caribbean, so they have a very different lens around how race operates than maybe someone who grew up on the continent or as African American, having been here for generations. So part of my class awakening was thinking about, wait a minute, if I am someone who is truly dedicated to the Black community and Black liberation, I also have to be mindful of when we talk about Black Lives Mattering, it can't just be the Black people who are educated or the people who aspire to sort of have high vaulted positions. And then how do we as a Black community really think about some of the sort of class dynamics that really undermine our collective movements?
It's so interesting that you say that. My class awakening, and I'd love to hear in the chat, tell us about your class awakening, folks in the chat, came when I was in high school. So I'm going to date myself, but I was the beneficiary of President Reagan's youth employment program, which was that in areas of high unemployment, employers could pay youth sub-minimum wage. So at the time, minimum wage, federal minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. When I started working at Wendy's, I made $2.85 an hour. And when that was when I was 15. When I left when I was 18, I was making $3.15 an hour. So
Wow.
still, yes. And my job was I was in the cafeteria, in the dining room, cleaning up the spills, stocking the salad bar. I had to polish the brass bar. I had to sweep and mop. I had to clean the bathrooms. I had to fry the chicken sandwiches. I mean, when I say I was hustling
Wow.
for $2.85 an hour, I was like running around that place like exhausted. But when it really clicked to me was seeing the managers at Wendy's. So because they were salaried,
Mm.
they were not really making that much more money than me per hour because they had so many responsibilities. There was no way that
Mm.
they could really execute on them in 40 hours. But yet
Mhm.
they were making so little money that it was really hard for them to save money or to go to school while working there as a manager. And I realized, dang, man, what is their career progression going to look like? They can maybe
Mhm.
become a manager at Pizza Hut. And that was when I was like, okay, I seriously have to get an education because I do not want to get stuck in this. But for so many people, that is the reality. I also think about how in my small, almost entirely white community, the really rich people were like the orthodontist and this one girl who went to my high school who carried a Louis Vuitton bag, and her parents owned a chain, like several different Taco Bells. That was how they
Mm.
got there. So that was also informing my class consciousness. Thanks for sharing your stories. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and that class awakening is so important because not only are we obviously race beings, we're also class. And then class is tricky because we oftentimes do not have the same shared vocabulary about class as we do around race, gender, or sexuality, for example. So when we have limited or uncommon vocabulary, and we're not also cued to sort of hold this lens in mind, it can be very easy for us to talk past each other when it comes to talking about class dynamics, and especially as they're inextricably tied to dynamics of sort of racism and white supremacy. And the other thought too is really understanding about how, not just sort of how they're inextricably intertwined, but the shame and guilt, wherever you fall on the class spectrum, having been impoverished for generations or growing up with substantial wealth, there's a great deal of guilt and shame and secrecy around relationships to money, access to money, status, how we speak, where you're educated, and the like. So here is this massive, complicated, amorphous system that really shapes how it is that we connect or disconnect with people, that becomes really important for us to develop some comfort around having a conversation such that we can really tackle these systems.
Yes, in a society in which we're constantly told that we have what we have because we worked hard, and that if others
Mm-hmm.
would work hard, they would have what we have. And this kind of onus and responsibility being placed on the individual,
Right.
while the whole system of white supremacy is a system of wealth and power accumulation that only benefits a tiny few. And by
Mm-hmm.
using racism, sexism, and all these other um, belief systems, allows like powerful white men to continue to accumulate tremendous wealth and power, while the rest of us hate ourselves and hate each other and are unable
Mm-hmm.
to unite across our racial differences, across our gender differences, because we're so suspicious of each other. We don't have confidence in ourselves, and we think,
Mm-hmm.
oh, if I could just work harder, I would have this, or, oh, I'm going to blame this on XYZ group that I'm not
Mm-hmm.
attaining whatever it is that I thought my life would be like.
Mm-hmm. And it becomes so important for us to really think about how, particularly that blaming and that scapegoating, that process is a very sort of consistent mechanism and operates on so many dimensions and modalities. So actually what I'll do is, let me click through, because this, there's a lot of quality. But this slide right here is sort of attitudes towards immigrants, thinking about how immigrants have been demonized across time. And then you see Irish, Russian, Hungarians, German, Catholic, Mexicans, Italian immigrants. These groups have all been sort of maligned. And then we think about the border conversations recently, and then all of the dehumanization happening in these detainment camps. These stories are not just isolated to Mexicans or Chinese or even Black people. This is the machinery of dehumanization. And it is very, very consistent. And then when we think about even Germans, Irish, people who have been granted whiteness provisionally over the course of history when it was denied to them initially. So if we understand that system broadly and some of those mechanisms, that also gives us an entry point around how do we sort of crush it in some ways and combat it, which makes me think of, let's see, there's a quote. Oh, this was I put a slide together with all the tweets that you wanted me to talk about. We'll get back to D&I in a moment. But one thing I wanted to share is, this quote from Shannon Sullivan from her book, Good White People, The Problem with White Middle Class Anti-Race. She said, class makes race unstable and slippery. The fracturing of whiteness makes the supposedly firm differences between white and Black people potentially unstable, resulting in the possible loss of whiteness. So some of the power that I found with using a class analysis is that white supremacy creates a culture around sort of prioritizing, fragility, and a whole bunch of dynamics that sort of cohere white people to each other, even as they're claiming we're all rugged individualists. But if you layer onto that sort of class dynamics, then that really is a sucker punch to this sort of delusional thinking that people are sort of playing into. When I think of Trump, for example, I think he is someone who advocates for white supremacist ideology, but he is not all for all white people. He is a person who is someone who supports the billionaire class, quite frankly. How can he help people sort of gain more wealth? And he now has the sort of national reach to sort of turn machinery towards corporate interests and the interests of other people who would otherwise derive their wealth through the exploitation of other human beings. So that's why it becomes critical for us to really have this lens of analysis, because he is not someone who is advocating for white writ large. He is advocating for a particular class of white people. But by leveraging white supremacy, he can get all of this buy-in and the belief that he is advocating for, quote unquote, making America great again is going to make life better for all white people, which is simply not true. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And if you could actually go to my slide toward the end about the median net wealth, what I want to know is, when are the white Trump supporters going to wake up to this fact, right? So it's this one at the very end there with the median net wealth. So this is this slide depicts.
Oh, do you see it? Which?
The one with the graph. The median net wealth of white families and Latinx families. So that's the slide advertising the next.
Sorry.
Okay, no worries. So the median net wealth of Black, Latinx, and white families, comparing it between 2010
This
and
one?
2013. Yes, thank you so much. So
Mhm.
we see this takes us back to the 2008 economic downturn. And
Mhm.
the wealth gap widened, where median net wealth among white families remained stable and somewhat appreciated during that time, where Black and Latinx families went down, all related to the subprime mortgage lending that triggered the 2008 downturn. So the 2008 downturn was caused by racism and the fact that
Mhm.
President Bush created a home ownership program to try to encourage home ownership amongst Black and Latinx families. But when they went in to apply for the mortgage, the banks sold them these terrible mortgages, and then they bundled them, and the hedge funders traded them, and then it all collapsed. And the banks got bailed out. The hedge funders did not lose their jobs. In fact, the private equity swooped in
Mhm.
and bought up all those houses. And now
Right.
these these same Black and Latinx families who lost all the money that they had saved toward that down payment are paying rent to Jared Kushner and BlackRock and all of these private equity who own those homes. And the reason why I want to bring this up in the context of COVID is, what is it going to look like after the CARES Act, right? So after the 2008 economic downturn, median Black net wealth was projected to be zero by 2053, Latinx by 2073. And now we have this CARE Act that has basically been a huge windfall to the 1% and screwed over the vast majority of just everyday Americans, getting that $1,200 check. Um, are we going to, will Trump's base turn out and vote for him, or will they realize that they are being hammered?
That is an excellent question, and my immediate response is to be determined, because I think that, well, one, I want to just say that the impact of COVID and the upcoming, whether it might be a recession or depression that's coming after this, is going to be cataclysmic. And we're already seeing with the racial and ethnic, if the racial and ethnic health disparities with COVID are a predictor of what the future to come, that the economic sort of impact is going to be leveling to communities of color. Um, so we have to anticipate that. And as far as Trump's base, will they or won't they? Not too sure yet, because they're also protesting the governors who are not opening up the economy, which is also born out of our lack of understanding around social class dynamics, but then also broadly the economic system. Even the government, when they spend so much focused time on how do we swell the wallets of corporate entities, that's a lack of consideration for the whole system. So, for example, when you have companies that are now shedding their workforces to save money, and then we know in the United States that health insurance is tied to employment for the most part. Well, some of these organizations were lobbying for tax cuts that then undermine the social safety net that they're now depending on as they shed their employees. So if there was legitimate consideration for the system and how fragile it is actually, capitalism, there probably would have been a great more reticence around advocating and sort of green lighting policies that would ultimately put us up in this very precarious position.
Yes, someone tweeted to me that she's been so moved by the corporate social responsibility response to COVID. And I wrote her
Mm-hmm.
back, I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm like, the corporations lobbied for that tax breaks. That's why our public infrastructure is so devoid of resources, and why our death rates are so high, and why we're so overwhelmed. Like, we need to have a public system. We need to have public schools. We need to have public
Mm-hmm.
hospitals. We need to have, instead, we've had this vast move toward privatization, and it's like the
Right.
gated community of who gets access to premier healthcare versus
Mm-hmm.
everybody else, and constantly trying to make that a tinier and tinier group. But yeah, there's got to be some kind of change because it's leading to death and devastation.
Mhm. And what one other thing I'll say too around how class is an important sort of worldview to hold into the center is that that also really shapes people's relationships to what is the public good. So, for example, if you are a very affluent person and can just buy particular services like childcare, security, your own private jet, and you don't necessarily need parks, libraries, or anything else that the public good benefits from, you could very easily get allured into thinking that your worldview is the exact same experience other people are experiencing. And having that myopia, we see that with Betsy DeVos, for example. The
Completely.
sort of very distortive power of growing up in a sort of class experience that is also like a bubble, but also a distortion of the very real experiences that other Americans are having, you know?
Yes, and then her complete and utter lack of empathy for anybody else's experience.
Mm-hmm.
We are running up on like 10 minutes too. I want to ask if you have questions for us, please put them in the chat. We'd love to take your questions in the last 10 minutes. Do you have any pressing points that you would like to make?
Ah, me? Yes. Let's see. Hold on. Let's see if this will cooperate with me as far as getting me back to a slide. So, what can we do? First order of business, we must seek out accurate history, share it widely, and then really become literate in history and not just settling for what is handed to us, being sort of very critical and examining who is the author, where does it come from, who do they intend for, and that can also apply to also just media literacy. We are inundated in lots of news, and not all of it is to our benefit. So enhancing that is really important. And then we also really have to be accountable to interethnic coalition building and allyship. I definitely want to credit the Brown Center for Students of Color at Brown University, and then the formerly known as Third World Center, as a sort of really critical space for thinking about anti-oppression and then also cross-cultural community building. And then also everyone fill out your census because that's so important for how all these um, how taxes are sort of shaped and who gets the benefit of what and sort of how many seats we get. So do it. And then also get politically engaged and hold elected officials accountable in any way that makes sense for you. I personally really just like writing angry letters. That may not work for you, but others can. You choose whatever works for you.
Yes. And I would just add, in addition to being politically engaged, get engaged in every institution that you are part of, in your workplace, in your kid's school, in your house of worship, in your local community. That's where we have the greatest lever for being able to influence things. We have to change, as I like to say, if changing federal law were enough to end discrimination, we wouldn't be where we are 50 years after a very successful movement, a movement that succeeded at changing our federal laws. We have to change hearts, minds, practices, and policies at the grassroots level and push up from there. That is how we're going to end discrimination. And those of us who are operating from a position of privilege, we have an incredible amount of power. And
Mhm.
sometimes I feel like we don't think we have any power. Hello, we have tremendous power, and this is how we use it, is by getting in there and saying, this stuff needs to change, because right now it's a numbers and resource um, uh, uh, game, right? So
Mhm.
white people need to be demanding these changes because we have more people, we have greater numbers, and we have greater resources, and we have greater positions of power. We have to be those allies and those advocates really pushing for change. Now, we can't be
Mhm.
doing that. We have to be following the leadership of women of color, of people of color, and listening. They have to be the ones who decide what change is needed and what tactics and stuff we should be using. But we got to be in the game, because that's how change isn't going to happen unless we
Right.
are part of it.
Questions, anyone, as we close this out? I just want to make sure we got a couple comments that I want to make sure to highlight. So Kristen shared, love this clarification. Trump's political tensions and the 2008 economic downfall clearly show us the impact of racism and classism on society at large. Charles shares, the role of class matters of race appear to be a division between expendable soldiers, poor whites, and the officers, wealthy. People of color not allowed to enlist, even though many continue to sign up. And also bring up when we talk about essential workers, Kimberly Crenshaw says this quite poignantly around essential and expendable, in the sense that it has always been our labor that they valued, never really our survival. Mm-hmm. And then Charles offers, the change can't happen when the ideology of any socialist model has been deemed toxic, even though it continues to be effective in other countries. And then excellent point, learn real history and not indoctrinated by the mainstream understanding. So particularly around socialism, I also think of United for a Fair Economy has this campaign around sort of responsible wealth, but then also arguing against the idea of the self-made myth that we hear about in the United States. If you work hard and you're meritocratic. And what they share is that we really need to operate on a perspective of built together, in the sense that America is both sort of democratic and socialist. And there is lots of different things that we benefit from that is born out of the social good. So how do we make sure that we don't lose sight of that, even as we're honoring sort of individual pluck and sort of innovation?
And if a pandemic doesn't show us how the health of the many is related to the health of the individual and vice versa, then how are we ever going to learn that? We truly cannot survive if we don't start treating each other better. Can you go to the Sweetwater Nanook slide, because I just want to make sure people know. I will send out the link for, I'll send out a recording of today, and also I want you to join us. It's next Thursday. I will send out a link to the invitation for that. And Sweetwater Nanook is the founder of Idle No More Washington, and she comes from a long line of healers, and we're going to be talking about reclaiming our health care, because really, obviously, coronavirus is showing how the healthcare system really fails communities of color, but this has been true for a very long time. So how do we use this opportunity to reconceive what healthcare is and to assert our power to transform the system? And she is one of the most brilliant women I know. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Shane, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Tuned in, and I apologize for our technical difficulties. Any parting thoughts from you, Shane?
No, thank you so much for this space. Everybody, continue conversations. Be on the lookout for resources. Check out Classism's website, www.classism.org. Actually, I think there is a slide with our information. So check out all these places and resources. I'm in love with Under the Black Light, that's hosted by Kimberly Crenshaw and her intersection. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's great seeing you on here. And thank you so much, Shane. I learned so much, as I always do whenever you and I get into conversation with each other.
Indeed. Thanks, Karen. Until next time.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, all.